of you, and a really very warm welcome to this session that we're hosting today. My name is David Hines, and I'm a senior manager here at Gold Standard, working on capacity development initiatives. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to this first session of our Masterclass series on carbon markets. And in this series, we're going to have 3 in-depth sessions exploring some of the most asked after topics in carbon markets these days. And each of our masterclasses is being delivered by a leading expert in the field. And so the first one that we're going to have today is going to cover the history of the market, right back from the beginnings in the early 1990s through to the present day, and then look forward at what might be coming. And when we were thinking about actually what topics that we should put on for this masterclass series, there was a nice Maya Angelou quote, which said, if you don't know where you've come from, you do not know where you're going. And we find this to be also very true of carbon markets, because so much has happened over the past 2 decades that it's actually quite hard to understand where we are today without understanding what has happened over the past 2 decades or so. So after today's session, we'll actually have another 2. And they are going to take place at the same time next Wednesday and then the following Wednesday. And so our second one is going to look at project development under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And the final one will be exploring project finance for carbon activities. So please do sign up to those if you haven't already. The sign up link is on our website. And I also want to say that this masterclass series is made possible with support from the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. So thank you to them. But before we get started on the content today, we would like to do a quick poll to see who we have joining us. So on your screen now, or it should come up shortly, should be a QR code through which you can access a Microsoft form, which has a couple of questions. So if you're able to scan that with your smartphone and respond to the questions, we can have a slightly better idea of who it is that we have.
David, I believe the code is not visible. Could you try moving the slides?
Oh, I'm sorry. We have. Do you see it now?
Not yet. Do you perhaps paste the link in the Q&A window?
Okay, we'll come back to it a little bit later. I will. So we can come back to that. But in the interest also in time, perhaps we can start. And for today's masterclass, we're really thrilled to be joined by Pablo Fernandes, who is the CEO of EcoSecurities. And for those of you who are familiar at all with carbon market, you'll know that EcoSecurities is really one of the most prominent companies that has been active in this space for over 2 decades. And Pablo himself has more than 20 years of experience covering climate policy, carbon markets, and climate finance. He first joined EcoSecurities way back in 2003, and he was working there until 2011, after which he joined Mercuria Energy Trading, where he managed their portfolio of clean development mechanism projects. And then Pablo was back to EcoSecurities in 2017, and since then he has served as board director and CEO of the company. He has a MSc in Energy and Environmental Planning and an MBA from the Business School of Lausanne. And generally, he's very well known in the carbon market and has been there to see its developments over the last 2 decades. So there's no one better really to walk us through the history of the market. Just before I hand over to Pablo, just a couple of words on housekeeping. Uh, One of the benefits of these sessions is that we get to hear directly from really leading experts in the topic. And so we really would encourage you to throughout post your questions using the Q&A function in Teams. And if you see a question that's been posted there that you like, do react to it. You're able to give it a thumbs up or an upvote. And then throughout the time we have today, we'll be taking Q&A from that, and we'll be answering the questions which people feel are most relevant. So please do make the most of that. But with no further ado, I will stop sharing and I will pass over to Pablo. Over to you.
Thank you, David. Let's see how is this working?
It's just coming up.
Just coming up. Okay. No, thank you very much, David and Gold Standard and the German government for allowing and enabling this opportunity of speaking to so many people at once. I'm glad to be able to share a bit of my experience. So as David already shared, I started working on the development of carbon projects literally 22 years ago now. I'm Brazilian. I started working mainly on Latin American projects, but throughout my career, I moved to Asia. I'm nowadays based in Geneva, and I joined numerous bodies, from technical bodies. So, for example, at some point, I was a methodology panel member of the CDM, to also other bodies more related to climate finance. So for 4 years, I was the private sector observer for the Green Climate Fund, and just some of the illustrations of my experience. And it seems that it's not working, so let me try again. But so when Gold Standard asked me to share here a bit of my experience, what I've seen on the booms and bursts of the carbon markets and the different phases, I was then quite excited to do that and to share that knowledge, especially because last year is it working? Last year, myself and then other members of EcoSecurities, we wrote a couple of articles about our views on the different phases of the market and how we see things evolving. So this opportunity from Gold Standard was timely, because then we could also share their data on different ways with a wider audience. So I'm assuming that everything is working now.
Yeah,
Okay.
we see it well, Pablo.
You see it. Okay. About then today, the idea is I'm dividing the session in these couple of hours that we're going to have now in 5 sessions, and at the end of each session, I will do a little moment for Q&A, and so keep sending your questions along the presentations, and then we're going to be answering each of these different topics along the way. And look, the idea is because I saw from the inscription of people different levels of knowledge about carbon markets, carbon credits, and etc. So I'm starting with the basic: what is a carbon market? What is a carbon tax? Then the rest of the presentation will be more focused on the carbon offsets and on the international markets related to carbon offsets. Okay. And then we will talk about each of the 3 phases, the comparisons of the phases, and a moment for discussion on what is next. Okay. So moving on with this initial introduction, I will try to be brief and quick here. But so environmental economics is pretty much the application of economic studies to environmental topics, and typical areas of study, they are related to elements that would enable better public policy developments by governments. One of the typical topics that is dealt with environmental economics is the externality, which is usually the unwanted effects of any sort of activity that we have. Pollution is a typical externality. So when we want to produce a service or a good, but to produce that, we end up with a bunch of unintended effects. And then actually the climate change is a kind of externality. So throughout the last 250 years, we emitted a lot of greenhouse gas emissions to Earth, not because we wanted. We actually wanted the energy services, we wanted the agriculture developments, etc. And we were not fully aware of all the externalities of that. And one of them was the climate change, right? But usually environmental economics has a wide range of topics and a wide range of areas that is studied. And as I said, is actually used to develop government policies, and usually government policies related to what is called economic tools. And those economic tools can come on very different ways, right? So it can come as grants, as tax breaks, as special credit lines for some activities. Specifically to environmental economics, you have these concepts of polluter payment and etc. And actually, related to our topic today, two typical instruments that are used in order to price those externalities and to create policies that can somehow inhibit the use of can diminish the externalities is one that's called market-based instruments, that for our case will be what we're going to call the emissions trading scheme or the cap and trade systems, and other fiscal instruments such as carbon taxes on this case. Okay, so and look, when you are developing those tools and instruments, some of the key considerations that you need to take into on the development of that is, okay, what is the more efficient tool for my ultimate goal? So should I aim one of these instruments that I actually rely on a market, or should I rely on some regulations based on command control? And then depending on on these elements, you go for one or for the other. But given that carbon emissions is spread over the entire society today, a wide range of sectors, then usually the solution to limit the greenhouse gas emissions have been more related to market-based instruments than command control. There are a few cases that command control was considered. You do take into consideration if you want to restrict some activity or if you want to promote another activity. So for example, a carbon tax is a typical instrument to restrict an activity, while a carbon offset would be an instrument to promote an activity. And if you're talking about a market-based instrument, you need to always take into consideration these elements of supply demand. So if you have this market-based instrument, you have a functional instrument. But those are just some concepts that we're going to touch on along the presentation today. So an emissions trading scheme, as I said, is also called cap and trade. So basically, a government selects a bunch of sectors. So which sectors that make sense for them to coverage, and when they cover, they set a cap. So they set a limit. Now all these sectors on my country can only emit, let's say, 1 million tons. Right. So then those 1 million tons are allocated among those participants of this cap. That is what we call allocation of allowances. So basically the government is saying you can only emit 1 million allowances. So these companies may receive some allowances or may need to buy those allowances in the market. Of course, that if they hold the allowance, they can buy and they can sell the allowances. The companies that would have a lower cost of reduction of their carbon emissions would eventually reduce more and sell the surplus. Those who have a higher cost will reduce less, will buy the surplus. At some moment, they have to monitor their emissions, and then they have to report that to the government. And every year, the government usually goes and reduces the cap. Okay. When you want to go for a tax, well, you don't have a cap. You actually set it's the same process. You set which or you define which sectors you want to cover, but then you set a price, which will be your carbon tax. And then you tell which of the covered sectors and will need to pay for that tax and how much they will need to pay. Okay, and then the rest of the process is similar to an ETS. But I like basically the difference between a cap and trade and a tax is that the cap and trade, you cap the emissions, but you let the market define the price. While on a carbon tax scheme, you set the price and you don't know what will be the emissions at the end. If you set a very high price, more likely that you're going to have a greater impact on the emissions. If it's a low price, you may have a smaller impact on the emissions. But this course today will focus on, well, as I said earlier, the international markets, but also the carbon credits or the carbon offsets. And these two mechanisms, the ETS or the tax, both of them can have what is called flexibility mechanisms, which are usually related to emission reductions that can happen outside the country or outside the covered sector. And rather than you promoting or incentivizing another market participant or paying the tax to the government, you try to utilize these flexibility mechanisms as part of your strategy to achieve your compliance to the scheme. Okay, usually those flexibility mechanisms, they range from 5 to 10%. So you do have some cases that are more than that, but that is the most usual levels of usage of these flexibility mechanisms. Okay, and that flexibility mechanism is, as I'm saying, is a way for you to transfer resources, transfer capital, either to other regions or the sectors, and promote the abatement on these other. Kind of a quick illustration of that. So if I have a cap and trade system, I do have here 2 installations. So one managed to reduce the emissions below the cap. As you can see, the blue is this excess. So the green is actually the emissions. The blue is the excess of emissions below the cap. Because it costs only $10 per unit for them to reduce. While on the red one, it costs, for example, $50. So the red is happy to pay $30 to buy or to incentivize installation 1 to reduce, and the installation 1 is happy to sell for 30 because it only costed them 10. And at the end, the total cost for the society is 30 and not 50 as it would be if there was no exchange mechanism, right? So that is the cap and trade system, and that's how the allowances are traded between players in the that are covered by the cap and trade system. But let's come to a scenario 2, where actually installation 1 didn't have any surplus. So you have the installation 2 that to meet that deficit would need would still need either to pay 50 to reduce, or the offsets are, rather than them paying 50 to reduce internally, they pay 50 to reduce elsewhere. So either, as I said, another sector within the country or another country. And when we have these payments related to other countries, then we do have the international carbon markets being developed. Okay. So that is, in a nutshell, how these work. And on a carbon tax, the concept is similar. So rather than you reducing your emissions or you paying the tax, you're going to be buying from someone externally too. So Nowadays, we do have more than 70 ETSs and carbon taxes across the world. So you do have one report from World Bank called States and Trends of Carbon Pricing that tries to capture and summarize everything that we have either under development or already on operational schemes. Okay, and it's kind of balanced. It's half is carbon tax and half is ETSs. And quite often you're going to see that many times countries may start with a carbon tax because it's usually a bit simpler to design. And as the country regulatory framework matures and as the players in the country mature, then it migrates to ETS. But said that, a lot of countries started with ETS straight away. Okay. And actually, a lot of countries have both. They may have a cap and trade system for some sectors, and they may have carbon taxes for others. So the two can coexist within the same country. It's just that they will cover different sectors. Okay. The little chart on the right side shows the price range of ETSs and taxes across the world. And this green yellowish area is what should be the prices by 2030 to comply with the 2 degrees scenario, and with the blue, the prices to comply with the 1.5 degree scenario as it was agreed in the Paris Agreement. And as we can see, most of the prices today are below $50, so they are far below what we need to stay under the 2 degrees scenario, and none is actually close to us for being able to stay on the 1.5 degree scenario. So again, we do need to increase our ambition and usage of these mechanisms, and try to work on how we can appreciate such prices to have a greater chance to stick to the scenarios that were agreed on the Paris Agreement. But yeah, so here's the snapshot of the world. And as I said, if you go to the World Bank side, you can find the report and the details of that. But yeah, just before moving to the next step, I want you to be clear. Like today, even if we have like over 70 schemes, we only cover 24% of our global emissions. Okay, and that is natural because you do have sectors that are very difficult to enforce anything, are very disseminated, etc. But then comes the question, right? So what we do? What about the other 76? So one of the ideas that was created was, okay, so 24% is covered by compliance and regulations, but then the other 76, what do we do? One of the ideas was this, okay, perhaps that can be tackled through voluntary pledges, not necessarily through regulations. And then with that, we had the development and evolution of the voluntary markets. So when there is no government or institution imposing neither a cap or a tax or charge, but then the companies understand that given that we live on a climate crisis moment, they do need to take climate action seriously. And then, well, nowadays you do have perhaps too many, but you have a bunch of processes for you to then monitor your emissions. So for example, the GHG protocol is one of the most popular platforms and standards for you to report your corporate emissions. You have CDP, that is another platform that collects all these reports and provide information and intelligence to the market. You have the SBTi, that stands for Science-Based Targets Initiative, which says, okay, I don't only want to see what you have to monitor, but I want to see what are your plans of reducing your emissions along the future, and ensure that those plans are aligned with science, aligned with what the scientific bodies say as the need to reduce along the time. VCMI, CVCM, so a soup of acronyms. By the way, if you like the carbon markets, you need to get, or if you want to work on the carbon markets, you need to get used to all these acronyms. Okay. But then the voluntary guideline is basically you should first of all try to reduce your emissions, your own emissions, and after that you try to reduce the emissions on your supply chain. But again, such reductions sometimes may need some time, or in other situations are even unavoidable. And for that, you can promote climate action through buying the carbon offsets. So again, the carbon offsets or the voluntary carbon markets, they are a supplement for you trying to work on your decarbonization process. They are usually something that represents you going beyond compliance. So for example, you may be a company that energy generation company, you may have part of your company emissions covered by a carbon compliance scheme, an ETS. But yeah, you're going to have the other part of the company that is not covered by that. So if you have a power plant, the power plant is covered, but the headquarters office is not. So we can use the voluntary carbon markets to cover your emissions that are not associated to the compliance schemes. Okay, and again, it is voluntary, but voluntary doesn't mean that you can do anything that you want. The idea is that you have actual and real contributions to the climate goals, that you act with integrity on this market, and that you promote emission reductions across the globe. Okay. And look, some drivers for voluntary buyers, when you talk to them, you're going to realize that they always want to, try to stick to their compliance pledges at a controlled cost. But the idea is that a lot of what they are doing is also used for communications, for outreaching their customer base and investors, etc. So this communication element is crucial for them. So with that, we are at the end of this first part, introducing what is environmental economics, what are the carbon pricing schemes, ETS, and carbon tax, and a snapshot of what is going on across the world. Okay, and so now we have here a quiz that will be followed by Q&A. What I would just want to check with you is, I'm assuming that all of you can see the quiz that is working. So there are two questions. One is, according to the World Bank report, the average carbon pricing across the world is $35. Which do you believe has a higher average price, carbon tax or ETS? And there is a second question now, which I cannot, and which, when we talk about market segments, compliance markets and voluntary markets, which do you believe has a higher offset, or a higher price for the offsets? Now, the question is, how do I still says no answers received. So I wonder if it is working. For myself.
It's possible to vote, Pablo, but it may be just that the system is a bit slow in updating.
Okay, thank you.
We may just go on.
I would then go on, and eventually I can come back later. But hopefully soon for the next cases, that works better. So anyway. Moving on. So anyway, I will show you the answers to this case. So today we do have carbon taxes with higher average prices. And by the way, it's average price, is not weighted average than ETS. So that is the answer of the question one. The question two, which of the market segments have a higher price? So it's compliance markets. So even if compliance markets, they have a lower price than well, ETS has lower price than carbon tax. So usually carbon offsets will have its price associated to allowances in ETSs. VCM, there is no reference, but today you may have some cases like VCM. You do have some carbon credits that have been traded over $200 or $500, but that is because it's related to a very specific technology and usually small volumes. The average price on the voluntary carbon markets, they are below $10, and a lot of the compliance markets you are above that. Anyway, Q&A. Do we have time to any questions? Yeah, I'm bang on time.
Yeah, there's
Rachel.
a few questions, Pablo, coming in. There's 3 or 4, so I can just quickly go through those. How do the voluntary carbon markets work exactly? Who emits and sells these credits if they're not regulated? That's question 1.
We are going to talk about that soon. Okay, so when we on the presentation, where I'm going to talk more about the voluntary carbon markets, what are the drivers of demand and drivers of supply and how all that works. What I can tell you is today there is no one who supervises the voluntary markets, especially from the demand side. So that says your company, you said that you would emit 100 and you will emit at 110, so you're above or below. Like there is no watchdog for that today.
Okay, and then you're probably going to come on to this as well. One of the questions is about additionality requirements to the voluntary carbon market. So
I think that is what we're going to jump on right now. Because so look, we're going to talk then about development of carbon projects and carbon offsets. Okay, and that is actually one of the first things to consider. Okay, so a carbon offset, as we saw on that previous graph, is you, rather than reducing your own emissions, because it may be complex, it may be difficult, it may be lengthy, it may be expensive, you then prefer to right now try to promote the reduction of the emission by someone else. But then this emission, without your incentive or your payment, that shouldn't happen. So as a result, I usually say carbon offsets, they are not an award. Because you're doing something right, you should receive it. We should see the carbon offsets as a kind of subsidy. So if that project wouldn't happen without some subsidy, then okay, you are eligible to receive carbon credits. If it would happen anyway, then you shouldn't receive those credits, because someone is not reducing their emissions thinking that they will be promoting the emission reduction elsewhere. So a carbon credit is a subsidy, not an award. A carbon credit is a result-based mechanism. So you need to prove that you reduce the emissions and not estimate, but prove. So you need to demonstrate the result, and only after that you get your carbon credits. And again, because climate change is a global issue, doesn't matter where you are reducing the emissions. So carbon projects and carbon offsets can be generated globally. Okay. As a consequence of these elements related to these principles of a carbon offset, so it is a result-based mechanism. So it needs to be measurable. You need to monitor, you need to report it, and you need to show what were the results that were achieved. You need to be able to demonstrate that you would have a baseline scenario without your project, and then you compare that to your project, and then that you have an actual emission reduction. Additionality. So the additionality is basically the concept of you showing that you do need a subsidy. You do have a series of barriers, and without the barriers, your project would not be, well, because of the barriers, your project wouldn't move ahead. And then those subsidies and incentives is helping you to actually implement that. You do have this element of environmental integrity. So you have discussions about the permanence of the project, about the fact that, okay, you need to generate the climate impact, but you also need to generate a bunch of other, at the very least, do no harm from social and from a biodiversity perspective, but ideally also supporting other aspects related to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay. And in order to be able to tackle all that together, we 30 years ago, actually even more than that, it was decided that we would have a project cycle with different parts of the cycle, sometimes demonstrate your additionality, your baseline, and sometimes demonstrate the results and outcomes of your measurements. Look, today, you do have UN guidance for most of the compliance schemes, and you do have some, the ICVCM that stands for the ICVCM that provides guidance for the voluntary markets. Okay, so voluntary standards that has as one of the key goals to supply credits to the voluntary markets. And I think that it's not that ICVCM guidance is better than the UN one, but I think it's very didactic. So I'm using that here as reference. So as you can see, you do need to have a good governance, independent governance, transparency on everything that happens on carbon projects, which, by the way, people complain about transparency of carbon projects, but I'm still to see anything else on any other financial area or anything that is more transparent than carbon. We can say that we would like to have even further transparency, but it's pretty, you have a lot of information about what's going on all the projects. And one of so on the governance, you always have a standard that takes care of all the projects, and then you have certification companies that becomes the eye and ears of the standards, checking what's going on the field. On the emission impact, as I said, permanence, additionality, and robust and conservative emission reduction quantifications, and environmental integrity. So all these other impacts related to the Sustainable Development Goals. So a carbon project development is divided in two cycles. I'm calling the cycle one, that goes from your inception, your idea of the project, up to what we call the registration of the project on a carbon standard. I'm using now here, rather than ICVCM, I'm using the UN cycle illustration. Look, all the standards may have slightly different names, but the rationale is pretty much the same. So you do have the design of or inception of your project. You may want to do some early checks and what we call feasibility studies in order to confirm that rather than before you commit yourself on high cost expenses on developing the project along the project cycle, you may do some initial analysis. But once you decide to go on, so you enter into this what we call the PDD to registration phase. And this phase, the main objective of this phase is to confirm that your project is eligible, matches all the criteria, and is eligible to claim carbon credits or carbon offsets. Okay. The outcome of this first cycle is your project is eligible. But because this is a result-based mechanism, you haven't, like usually this cycle happens before you are operational. So you have no results to show, so you have no credits issued, okay? And so usually the critical elements that you access, so you have your project design document, or the PDD as we stand. And this PDD will have a detailed description of the project, what is the technology, where it's located, who is involved on that, which standard you're applying, and then the standards that usually they set up methodologies for you to to quantify, to define your baseline scenario, to demonstrate optionality, and to quantify your emission reductions. So you need to prove that that methodology is applicable and eligible to you. And later on, you demonstrate the application of that methodology to your project. So you show how you define your baseline and what is your baseline. You have all your models on how you quantify your emission reductions, and you estimate your emission reductions along the time. You're gonna also present how you expect, like which parameters you expect to monitor and measure, and how those parameters will be linked with your model for emission reductions, and what are all the other environmental and social aspects that are related to your projects. So the impacts that you have, the engagement with applicable local stakeholders to your project, how you did any consultation with them, etc. And when we talk about the UN mechanisms, you do have this element of government approvals. When we talk about voluntary markets purely, then usually there is no government approval. So you do all these analyses and you put together all these critical elements, as I said, on a PDD. If you are using one of the UN standards, you try to seek also national approval for your project. And once you have all that ready, you're going to go through what is called the validation process. And the validation process is usually a certification company or a third party that will come and check your documentations, all the references to that, and try to confirm that indeed you apply the methodology correctly, you are eligible, you are additional. And then during this validation phase, you may have site visits, you may have spot checks, etc. As an outcome, you have a validation report where this entity that we call validation verification body or designated operational entity will come with an opinion. Indeed, the project applies correctly and complies with all eligibility criteria. So I suggest that project to be registered. Then a standard, on this case here, was the Clean Development Mechanism Executive Board. So the standard from UN, or could be gold standard, or could be many other standards that we're going to talk later. We'll then accept all that documentation and we'll register the project. Usually this registry is a public registry. Everyone can access that, can see the status of the project, and can see all the documentation about the project. When you reach the end of that process, as I said, it means that you have an eligible project, just that. So as soon as you move into operational phase, you start to monitor and measure your results, and you're going to go on the next cycle. Okay. The next cycle is what's called MRV, so monitoring, reporting, and verification. So it goes from your operational start date up to the issuance of credits. The cycle 1 usually happens once every 5 or 10 years. The cycle 2, you define the frequency based on your own economic decisions. Typically, this cycle 2 happens every year. So I complete 1 year of operations, I have all my results, and then I start the second cycle. So usually all that monitoring information that I collected, I put together on what is called the monitoring report. And then the monitoring report will have a similar process to the validation, but this time it's called verification. So a third party will come, will check my data, if I collected the data properly, if I had quality control and quality assurance processes, if my data is real, etc. And if my calculations are all correct, and assuming that everything is correct, then the certification company will send a request for issuance for the standard, and the standard will issue the credits. So again, the outcome of the objective of this cycle is more focused on the quality of the monitored data and confirm that your emission reductions indeed happened, and then you continue in full compliance with the methodology, local requirements, local regulations, etc. Okay, so the outcome, as I said, is you do have the credits issued, and you have the confirmation that you continue to be eligible to claim credits on new cycles. So this understanding is important. So we have these 2 steps, and the step 2 repeats many, many times. Okay. And let me just touch on this because so we have 3 concepts that are usually mixed, confused, but they are very different things. So one is baseline concept. The second is additionality concept and emission reduction calculation concept. I got all these definitions from the Clean Development Mechanism glossary, just to rather than using my own definition. But the baseline is the scenario that would reasonably represent the situation without the project. So maybe the situation of a sector, maybe the situation of a factory, maybe the situation of a farm, right? And the Kyoto Protocol establishes 3 processes for you to define your baseline. So it can be on historical data, benchmarking, and model and financial modeling. So historical data, you take yourself as reference and you look back. You look to your past, what historically you have been doing, and you say that you can project history to the future. Financial modeling is usually used when you say, well, my history cannot apply, so I need to come with something new, and I will do a financial analysis to see what is the most attractive course of action for my new future. And benchmarking is when rather than look into you, you look to what is happening surrounding you, right? So you take a benchmark of the sector and you assume that, yeah, that is the practice of the sector. Okay. And then the point is ways for you to as I said, that there is financial modeling. So financial analysis is one of the tools that you can use for defining your baseline scenario. As I said, you have benchmarking, so kind of common practice analysis may be one of the tools for you to define your baseline process. So one thing is what is the concept, the other thing was what are the tools that you have to demonstrate that one scenario rather than the other should be the baseline. The second thing, and the second thing is additionality. So as I said, additionalities demonstrate that without the carbon credits, your project wouldn't happen, right? The point is usually for you to demonstrate the additionality, you use the same tools as they use to demonstrate baseline. And that is when the confusion starts to happen, right? You may define that your baseline is your historical data, and that's it. Now you may demonstrate your additionality, saying that your proposed project, it's not financially viable. So you use a financial analysis to demonstrate additionality, okay? Sometimes you may use the same tool, the financial analysis, to demonstrate your baseline and additionality. So that's when confusion comes. And then you have the emission reduction calculation. So baseline will be a scenario. Additionality will be a test. So yes or no. And emission reduction calculations will be the quantification of your emissions on your baseline scenario and on your project scenario. Okay. But yeah, these 3 concepts means that different types of projects may have problems on defining the baseline. Others may have problems on additionality, others on the model. Okay. But when a standard setter or someone proposing a methodology is working on it, it has to take into consideration, okay, I need to find a reasonable way to demonstrate additionality and baseline, and a reasonable way to do the calculations that is conservative and that is reasonably cheap. So I do not have super high transaction costs. And then you have these discussions on what you as a standard setter has to focus on. False positives, so projects that shouldn't be projects, but they are. So they are the false positives, or the false negatives. So projects that should be projects, but they don't manage to adequate with all these requirements, and you end up excluding the possibility of a lot of actions. Okay. And here, just to illustrate typical types of carbon projects. So you do have on the energy sector, renewable energy, energy efficiency. So renewable energy, it covers solar, wind, hydro, tidal, all the biomass, so all energy sources that do not emit greenhouse gases, and you can consider that eligible. Energy efficiency, that can be measurements on the generation of energy, on the transformation, or on the consumption of energy. Cook stove, efficient cooling systems, or efficient heat systems for industry, all that would fall into energy efficiency. Full switch, you may not be more efficient, but you are switching from diesel to ethanol. That would be a full switch, right? So biofuels, biomass power, etc. Or you may even be switching from internal combustion in cars to electric cars. That's also considered somehow of a full switch. You have a lot of what we call industry emissions. So usually processes on the industry that emit CO2 or other non-CO2 gases. So abatement of N2O and HFC, we're gonna talk a lot about that. You have like CO2 emissions on the salmon production process, or energy efficiency inside the industry where you recover energy heat or energy waste, etc. You have a wide range of measures and project types on industry. Waste management, usually related to solid waste or liquid waste. So biogas systems, biodigesters, recovery of biogas from landfills, composting, so also a wide range of cases and technologies. Agriculture, so everything related to regenerative agriculture practices or improvement of soil, changes on patterns of usage of fertilizers and other agriculture products, or enteric fermentation reduction from cattle and other. So it covers a lot of things. Forestry and conservation, so here it goes either reforestation, commercial forestation, or avoidance of reforestation or degradation, which we call RED. Okay. And more recently, when IPCC said, well, we will not be able to reach the 1.5 degree only by reducing our emissions, we may need to remove it. So you had an explosion of new technologies trying to find out how we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So we have what we call direct air capture, carbon capture and storage, biochar, etc. So a wide range of technologies and practices for that removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Let's see if the quiz works now. So I got here six types of projects, and let me see if I can make this work. 6 types of projects, and I would like to have a quick discussion with you. What is the biggest challenge for each of these 6 types of project? Is if it is the baseline definition, additionality demonstration, the modeling and calculation of emission reductions, the permanence of such removals or emission reductions, the monitoring of that, or the demonstration of co-benefits. David, is it working now? Or should I then, even if I try to do the quiz, as you suggested, skip to the Q&A straight away?
Maybe we'll give it 30 seconds, Pablo. We can answer the question it comes up. It's just at the moment the response is not showing on the slide.
Okay.
But also, if you could put the QR code back, if you just yeah.
Here you have the QR code and you have the link for the forms.
Yeah.
I just simply don't know why. Let's see.
Or maybe refresh.
Yeah. So refresh, I get it.
Oh.
That's it. Okay. So yeah, now the answers are coming. Let me then go through some Q&A and then allow time for a couple of more answers.
Okay. So Pablo, there's a few questions around what are the usual DNAs that approve VCM projects?
So usually VCM projects do not rely on government approvals. So the DNAs or designated national authorities do not exist for voluntary projects. They usually exist only for compliance cases. So mechanisms that somehow will be linked to UN and to governments. Okay.
Great. There's a question around financing and sort of the development of projects. So one of them, I'll give you a couple of questions here. One of them's around what's the typical stage that you tend to see debt-based financing for projects. The other one was around can individuals and organizations develop projects, and what's the process for that?
So look, today, let me try to answer the second first and then the first. But so anyone can develop projects. You do have different roles for you to be a project on the project development process. So you can be the one who is designing the project and owning the asset and running the asset and generating the emission reduction. You can be a consultant and provide support to someone who's doing that, and that exists because nowadays we have dozens of standards, each standard and methodology usually with hundreds and hundreds of pages. So it is a complex process. It requires a quite specific set of knowledge. You can be a certification company, right? Or you can work for one of the standards. So again, you have a supply chain for you to be involved on a project. Not to say that when you have the credits on your hands, you have also a supply chain related to the sales of that. So you have retailing platforms, you have insurance companies, you have like a bunch of service providers on trying to facilitate the trading and exchange of those credits. So anyone can do that at different roles across the supply chain. And related to climate finance, so look, I'm assuming that there is a third class and they will go deeper on that, but debt instruments are for what we call risk, not risk-free, but low risk cases. So for you to be able to use carbon credits for debt finance, you do need to have a proven and track record on the technology. You will need to have an offtake agreement, preferably at a fixed price, so you can have that as a secured source of revenue for your project, and then someone can accept that as one of the guarantees or one of the elements for you to structure a debt instrument. But I understand that will come in more details later. But that is one of the criticisms of the carbon credits. Because it's a result-based mechanism, it only comes after you are fully operational and you can demonstrate your outcomes. You only have certainty of that product, when you are fully operational, which means that you already did the investment for you to reduce your emissions. Okay.
Have we got time for one more question on sort of grouping these? There's a couple of questions that have come in about certain technologies, if there are emerging technologies, and if you don't know the full efficacy of the technology, or if there's any kind of changes in some of those assumptions, how is that dealt with in terms of credits to the project? And then similar kind of question around if you're sort of developing a project and there's adverse social impacts that you didn't previously foresee, how that have an impact again on credits. How do you recalibrate? How do you take that impairment forward? How do you recognize that in project?
I will start again with the second, because then the first one I connect with the quiz. Look, whenever you have a big social or environmental impact, depending on how big it is and your lack of ability to remediate that, that may lead to you not being eligible anymore. So you do not comply with your eligibility requirements. If it is something temporary and you have ways to remediate, then you may still be eligible. But usually all the standards, they have the minimum level of do no harm. So if you do any harm, that means that you're not comply with that eligibility criteria and you may not have your credits. Other cases, again, if you can show that it's temporary and you can reverse that, eventually they may say, okay, when you reverse that, you come back and you continue and we resume the issuance of credits. But social and environmental aspects are that important, is your ability to demonstrate that you comply or do not comply with the eligibility requirements. Then the other one related to new technologies and then uncertainties related to that technology, that connects with this quiz here. What happened? So that connects with the quiz here. Sorry, I have two slides, two screens. So look, you do have cases that the challenge may be for maybe your emission reduction calculations. You have complex models and then, for example, the energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is a typical type of case that it's not that it's difficult for you to demonstrate what would be your baseline scenario. It may be difficult for you to find a way to come with a model, because you may have a lot of uncertainties and a lot of factors. You may come with a model that your baseline and your project's emission levels are not far enough, and the noise and uncertainty of that makes you actually report that there is no emission reduction being generated, purely because of the emission reduction challenges, the calculation challenges. So if you do have a new technology, the likelihood that this new technology will have a higher risk perception and uncertainty is higher, and then that may generate problems for you. It's interesting here. I will just cover, so cook stoves, for example, pretty much there was a very small amount of co-benefits. Everyone agrees that cook stoves is a typical case that you do have a lot of co-benefits. So that is not that much on dispute. The questions that you may have is indeed on how you measure the continual use of the stoves and how you calculate your emission reductions. Those are two of the biggest challenges on wood cook stoves. Wind energy, yeah, that is the common sense. Usually the challenge is optionality. So renewable energy, it's becoming more and more a common practice in many places, and depending on the size and the location, yeah, you don't need any further support. So you don't need subsidies, you don't need that. So that happens. When you go to let's say higher risk regions, Africa is the typical example. Yeah, wind may still be additional in Africa, but it's definitely not additional in Germany or even Brazil or India, right? REDD+, it's interesting. I have a slightly different view here. So permanence is indeed a risk, right? So we're talking about the forest. Forest can be exposed to fires, for unplanned and unintended other deforestation events. But I think that the big challenge around REDD+ projects, more than you defining what is the baseline. So the scenario, you can say it's not that difficult. So it's usually for REDD+, we assume the historical emissions. You do get what are the historical emissions for a certain area, and you apply to your project scenario. The challenge is usually quantifying the historical emissions. Then you enter into a lot of disputes on how to quantify that. So I would say that REDD+, more than defining the baseline, is defining the quantification. And last but not least, well, direct air capture, I'm aligned. The biggest challenge is co-benefits. Usually you don't have any co-benefits related to that. So you do have an industrial facility that will be there sucking energy from a system that is already energy thirst, and usually a couple of jobs created, but not much more than that. And industrial wastewater treatment is the case that the challenge is usually demonstrating what is your baseline, because different industrial segments, depending on where it is located, it may vary. So the same type of industry, so let's say wood processing industry, if it's located in the middle of nowhere, you may say anaerobic lagoon may be the cheapest treatment and a reasonable one. But an aerobic lagoon has a lot of smell problems. So an aerobic lagoon is never a baseline scenario if you are close to an urban area. So your challenges are how you define properly the baseline scenario for an industrial wastewater treatment, take into consideration all these details and elements of that. So again, here was just a quiz to show that, yeah, different technologies and project types will have different challenges along the way. Okay. Let me move on. Okay. So look, now that we know what are the carbon pricing schemes, what is a project, what are the types of projects, and how these projects are generated, we are going to connect these projects and the carbon pricing schemes together. Okay. And we're going to talk a bit about the history. That was the mission that was assigned to me. Talk about what are the carbon credits, what is the international carbon market, what is a carbon offset, and how all that comes together. So I do divide my view of the world, and you may find different articles with slightly different variances of that, but a certain consensus on the existence of these three phases. So there is what I call phase 0 or pre-Kyoto. So it's the pre-1997 period, where you had a lot of science going around. You had a lot of academic studies around that. You had a couple of pilot transactions, but yeah, by the way, pre-Kyoto era, because there was no compliance schemes or no regulatory framework, it was by definition a voluntary phase, right? And then the landmark was 97 when the Kyoto Protocol was approved, and then it created the first carbon market international mechanisms. But then the Kyoto Protocol itself, it has its boom and burst. So at some point, that phase faded away, and it was replaced by what we call the voluntary carbon market phase. That also had a boom and burst, and is now being replaced by the Paris Agreement phase. Okay, each of these phases may have sub-phases, so sorry for that. But yeah, the idea is that now we have a deep dive on each of these three phases, and we understand what were the elements from supply, from the demand that led to the boom, the burst, and of the market. Just because, yeah, not coincidentally, you see that happening more than often, right? So look, Kyoto Protocol. So as I said, 97 was the creation. 2001 with the Marrakesh Accords was when it was fully regulated. Basically the equivalent to what happened in Baku last year for the Paris Agreement. But from 2001 up to the first registration, remember that at that initial cycle, 3 years. So the first project was registered only 2004. The first issuance only happened in 2005. But the Kyoto Protocol, one key concept was the common but differentiated responsibility. So the Kyoto Protocol divided the world in two. So there was the Annex 1 countries that were basically the OECD countries or the developed economies, and the non-Annex 1 countries, that was the rest of the world. So it was roughly 30, 40 countries on the Annex 1 and another 150 plus on the non-Annex 1. The Kyoto Protocol was the baby steps of carbon market. So the goal there was to start at that point of time on the on the 90s. We didn't have a sense of urgency, so the goal was move the world towards the emission reduction scenarios. So start with what I do call marginal abatements. So all these developed economies would have the goal of reducing their emissions on average in 7%. You had some countries with 10, others with 2, etc. But the average was 7% in relation to the 1990 emissions. Okay, and then they created 3 market-based mechanisms to help the countries to achieve such targets. So they created the emissions trading, which was, so that 7% basically created a cap to the countries. So all the countries would receive allowances, and they could trade among themselves such allowances. Of course, only Annex 1 countries received such allowances, because only them had targets. Then there was the joint implementation, which was a project-based scheme, so which Annex 1 countries could generate offsets. Usually those offsets were backed by allowances and could trade among them. And then there was the famous Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, that was for all the non-Annex 1 countries, where they could use these carbon credits to deploy or to accelerate emission reduction activities on their countries. Okay. As I said, JI and emissions trading, Annex 1, but JI and CDM, the project-based mechanisms. Okay. But then actually what ended up happening was that among all those 40 countries, you could divide in 3 big groups. So the groups of Annex 1 countries that were not committed with the market at all. So US that never ratified the Kyoto Protocol was the most common illustration for that. You had what I'm calling flipping countries. So Canada and Australia, every time that they would change their prime minister or president, they would flip. So sometimes they were supporting the climate agenda and they were buyers of carbon credits. Sometimes they were dismantling all that. So those 2 are examples of countries that during from 97 to 2020, they flipped many times. And then you had Japan and Europe as the 2 main buyers, and the 2, what I'm calling here, the demand drivers of the market. Okay. And Europe had an interesting approach. Europe said, okay, the countries or the bloc will have a goal, but part of that goal, we're going to set up an emissions trading scheme, and we are going to pass by that obligation to the private players. So at the end, we're going to try to achieve our Kyoto goals through governments acting as buyers, but then a bunch of private players acting as buyers as well. So they set up what's called today the EU ETS, or the European Emissions Trading Scheme, that covers more than 12,000 companies across Europe. Okay. And the EU ETS, it's currently on the phase 4, but during the Kyoto phase, there were 3 phases. So there was a phase 1, which was the pilot phase that was from 2005 to 2007. Again, with a quite high annual cap of 2 billion allowances per year, and permitting the use of 10% of offsets as a flexibility mechanism. And because it was a pilot phase, because there was an overallocation, etc., there was no bankability of the allowances from phase 1 to phase 2. Then phase 2 was, let's say, when the game really started. So in 2007, the allocations of the entire phase 2 and phase 3 were actually defined. And it started with this annual cap of 2 billion allowances as well, and going down. So for example, at the end of phase 2, we were already closer to the 1 billion of 1 billion. No, sorry, no confusion. So with the cap of 2 billion allowances, but with that cap going down with the time. Okay, and again, the 10% usage of offsets potential. And And then there was the phase 3. So the phase 3 was also had the allowances allocation defined on 2007. And when it started the phase 3, the cap was already 1.6 billion, and it kept going down. Okay. So in total, if we would get the phase 1 and 2 and the total potential demand for the UETS from 25 to 2020, it was roughly 1.7, 1.8 billion tons in total. And if you divide that through the 15 years, was just above 100 million tons per year. Okay. Japan was also on the early days, especially like from 2000, early 2000s, was one very important player, was very proactive. But the Japanese demand in comparison to the European demand, it was quite small. So it ended up that Europe was the price maker and Japan was a price taker in terms of international trading. But the Japanese commitment to the Kyoto Protocol actually faded away in 2011 when we had the Fukushima incident. So that earthquake close to a nuclear power plant, and then you had leakage of nuclear material, etc. And the outcome of that was Japan deciding that wanted to shift away from nuclear power. And then at some point in 2011-12, they said, look, I have other priorities. I'm going to comply with my Kyoto goals by 2012, but after that, I'm out. Okay. So at some point, the Kyoto Protocol phase had Europe as pretty much the only source of demand. But then what happened on the supply side? So on the supply side, as I said, the first registered project was 2004, the first CDM project, as you can see on the chart on the right. The first issuance was on 2005. From 2005 to 2008, roughly, that was a learning process, a learning period, and UN was struggling to speed up the issuance process. By 2010-11, you can see that is when it started to speed up the issuance process. So you started to have a more steadier supply of credits coming into the market. Okay. But what happened, and somehow a lot of people were already indicating that as a risk, was that on the 2010-11, Russia and Ukraine started to get involved with the development of JI projects. And that is because you remember when I said the Kyoto Protocol took 1990 as year of reference. So yeah, that was a couple of years before the Soviet Union regime would fall apart. So at that point of time, they still had very high levels of industrial activity. After the Soviet Union regime would fall apart, the industrial levels of activity massively decreased, not because of any climate-related effort, but economic reasons. And then you ended up with what's called hot air. So emission reductions that were achieved even if no efforts were done. And basically what these countries started to do was to convert that hot air into JI credits. And that actually had a big impact on the market, because suddenly, very quickly, a lot of credits, as you can see here on the chart, 1 year over 500 million tons credits came at once. In total, JI issued more than 800 million tons. So yeah, it was a big impact on the supply. And from 2011 onwards, yeah, then UN became a well-oiled machine, and all the CDM projects were managing to go through the cycle, issue credits, etc. Okay. And that first cycle, the Kyoto phase, as you can see here, is what I call, it was a infrastructure project phase. So the vast majority of the credits and the vast majority of the projects were related to renewable energy, to industry, to Energy efficiency, so that was by far the vast majority of the credits and the projects. So renewable energy, number of projects, but industrial emissions in terms of credits. So yeah, we had the supply, we had the demand, and usually a price curve is the combination of of supply demand. So any price, again, is the outcome of the supply demand balance. Usually, if supply goes up, you may have prices going down. If the demand goes up, usually demand prices go up, and vice versa, right? So this chart, it just shows in blue what was the price levels of the EU allowances on phase 1, price levels of EU allowance on phase 2, EU allowance on phase 3, and CR prices. CRs are the offsets generated by the CGM. Okay. So actually, rather than explaining what will happen in details, I will actually go through the quiz and then I explain that as part of the quiz. Okay. And while, let me refresh. I hope that now I'm collecting all your. So what I want you to do is I signed it here 7 events, and I want you to categorize each of these events, so event 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, as a demand shock event because of end of a market phase, or demand shock event because of financial crisis, supply shock event, offset inflows, or supply shock event, allowance market reserves. And then I can explain a bit what happened during the Kyoto phase, and is the fact that you had Europe, so that's why the relationship, the prices here of the European allowance on phase 1, 2, and 3, and then the CR, the offset prices, so equivalent to the international markets and the international instruments linked with the European prices. Rachel, any questions about the Kyoto phase that I can answer while collecting the responses?
Not really. Some of the other questions still relate back to, there's one that came in, but that relates back to the previous section. So, I mean, if you're happy to take that,
yeah.
It talks about, is there an indication on which is considered more important, the CCP label or a rating? And that leads on from an earlier question that said, how important are ratings agencies like B0 and Silvera in development of carbon projects?
I'm going to talk about that, but I can provide a bit of spoiler alert. No, so look, the ICVCM and the CCPs, or the core carbon principles, they decided that the way for them to evaluate the core carbon principles, they would evaluate, well, the governance of a standard and then the other elements of methodologies. So they only review standards and methodologies, but they don't review how project developers apply such standards and methodologies. Okay. So the CCP label will always be related to the standard methodology. You may be applying that correctly or wrongly. If you manage to get registered, you get your CCP label. Okay. But as I mentioned on the previous session, yeah, usually the methodologies, they have a lot of elements and a lot of decisions that you need to take on applying that methodology. Many times you may have some rooms for picking and choosing different parameters, aspects, etc. So you may end up having an overestimated or underestimated emission reduction. You may end up defining a baseline scenario that's widely acceptable, or defining a baseline scenario that not a lot of people agree that should be the right one, even if you comply with methodology and was considered eligible and all that. So usually the rating agencies, they tend to they should be doing more these analysis of how the methodology is applied to the context, specific context of a project. Okay, so that is usually but if rating agencies are an important element of the market, we can discuss more about that later. So let's go then, event one. Anything else, Rachel? Can I come in here to the quiz and talk about what happened during the Kyoto Protocol phase?
Yeah, I think let's move on to the quiz.
Okay. So event one, yeah, it is right whoever said that it was a demand shock, end of market phase. So you could see phase 1 and 2 prices, they were very correlated because you could use allowances from phase 2 and phase 1, but not the other way around. The closer we got to the end of the phase 1, then the prices started to decorrelate until phase 1 was over, and then any leftovers of phase 1 was pretty priced at zero, right? And the phase 2 continued. So an exchange was only launched on later 2007-8, so you had these prices, screen prices going on as of that time. Indeed, the first transactions that I got involved on 2003-4, yeah, the prices were on the range of $3 to $5, so it's not very bad, that dotted area, that dotted line. But then you can see that the event 2 was roughly on 2008. And what happened on 2008? The banking financial crisis. So with that banking financial crisis, remember what I just mentioned about the hot air from the Russia and Ukraine. So they suddenly, because of economic crisis, they reduced their emissions and their activities. Yeah, with the financial crisis, then there was a massive reduction of activity. And if there was a reduction of activity, but the allowances were already distributed, what happened? Yeah, there was less demand. And with less demand, prices collapsed. Okay. So on this case was a demand shock, financial crisis. And then we had a couple of years, roughly 3 years of steady operations, 2009, 10, 11. And what happened on 2011? So the event 3, the second financial crisis. So as you may remember, that financial crisis of 2008 had 2 waves, one in 2008, one in 2011. So in 2011, you had even further decrease on demand and prices dropped again. Okay. Then on 4 and 5, so the 2 things that happened there, you actually had 2 supply shocks. So basically, you started to have the CDM working well and operating well and issuing credit steadily, but you also had the JI coming into the market. And then suddenly the CR price started to go down and got decorrelated from the allowance prices, up to a point that by the end of 2013-14, there was already credits enough to attend all the demand of the phase 3 of the UETS. So the outcome of that was zero, because there was no more demand, and there was still supply coming to the market. Okay. So yeah, that was kind of the end of the Kyoto era, as we know, relying on the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms. And then, as I said before, the allowances were until 2020 were allocated in 2007. So before these two crises. So at some point, the European Union realized that the market was so long and the prices would stay low if they wouldn't do any adjustment. So the 6 is a supply shock allowance market reserve. So basically, what the European Union did was roughly 400 or 500 million tons of allowances that should be auctioned on during these years. They pushed that volume to be auctioned rather than 13, 14, 15 to be auctioned on 18, 19, 20 or 17, 18, 19. So there was a supply shock. And with the supply shock, you could see that the prices started to go up. So it went from the roughly 5 euros to almost 10 euros, right? Until some further correction came in when we were getting closer and closer to the supply be back to the market. Then came the event 7, and the event 7 was when that allowance market reserve was supposed to come back, and then the European Commission managed to say, no, it will not come back. And together with that, you also had some acceleration of economic activities, and then the market got tighter, and the allowances went back to pretty much the pre-28 levels. Okay, and again, because the Kyoto Protocol finishes on 2020, that is basically the end of the Kyoto phase. So here, I think the outcome of here is just to say, look, the carbon markets, it had what we call the carbon markets 1.0, which is this moment of 2006 to 2011, 13, when the market was huge, a lot of players came in. There were developments of thousands and thousands of projects across the world. You have the European emissions trading scheme functioning, and being the price setter, the CRs and the international carbon offsets following the European prices until a couple of events made this decorrelation of the CR prices and international prices to the UETS prices. But then, what happened? Well, we had a new phase. So the voluntary carbon market phase. And again, this voluntary carbon market phase, we kind of divide into 3 phases. So there was the very early days of the VCM up to 2006, when you had like the set stones of that happening. So 2005, you had a bit before 2005, you had CDP being created, you had gold standard being created, you had VCS being created. So all of that happened towards the end of this phase, up to 2006. And then from 2006 to 2016 or 15 was when you started to see a kind of consolidation, a growth of all these corporate carbon reporting, the consolidation of the voluntary standards, the creation of SBTI, etc. And at that point, we already, with some few standards, some few voluntary carbon credit standards on the market. But what kind of matters is that the blooming phase, as I'm calling, right? So that was when the voluntary carbon markets pretty much took over from the Kyoto markets, because as we could see on the last chart, there was one point that the demand or the price of CRs was pretty much zero. So there was no more demand from the compliance market, and people started to then try to find other pockets of demand, with the voluntary being one of them. So from 2017 onwards, you started to see this strong push for corporate demands, carbon footprints, a lot of tools, this crazy adoption of CDP, SBTI also getting a lot of traction, and then you would see jumps on retirements related to voluntary standards. At some point, it reached 150 million tons per year, right? But especially from 2020 onwards, things got a bit out of control. So you did have this explosion of the market. So even if I'm saying that it started to heat up from 2017, it was from 2020 that it exploded. Here I'm showing kind of my view with my own words and numbers. But for example, at some point, the VCS issued a report showing a bit of the traction on their side, and they divided also on, they used other words, but they divided also on these 3 phases, and they are showing here the size of the transactions, and you can see how the market evolved over the time. Okay. So usually when we're talking about VCM nowadays, we're talking about this 3rd phase, when, yeah, the phase 2 was the transition from Kyoto to VCM, and phase 3 was when VCM took it over. But one of the characteristics of that was this market suddenly booming, but also booming the complexity of it. So yeah, as you can see, like the number of new standards really accelerated from 2016 onwards, and we literally, if on the early days, as I said, like 2005, we had 3-4 standards. Nowadays we have over 30 standards. But even if we have over 30 standards, you can see on the chart on the right that there are three standards that still dominate and are responsible for the bulk of the credits, right? Which is gold standard, the verified carbon standard, and the CDM, which was the UN standard. Okay. But yeah, so this sprouting of voluntary carbon standards was something, and exactly because it doesn't require any government approval or any government connection. Yeah, anyone could generate a standard. Now talking about the demand drivers of this market, like following a similar pattern of and a similar structure from the other phase, right? So what happened? Like what created this demand for the voluntary pledges? So as I said, a lot of companies started reporting their emissions. From reporting their emissions, a lot of companies started to then report what would be their emission reduction pathway. And then a lot of people started to have a lot of things to say a lot of things on that. So you ended up with a moving target, different market participants pushing on different directions. So carbon neutrality migrating to zero emissions migrating to net zero, etc. So all that ended up at the beginning creating great excitement and boosting the demand, but that excess of complexity ended up also at some point, and sometimes some unrealistic goals or very high abatement costs at some point ended up making a lot of companies to move away, right, of these climate pledges and commit. So nowadays, when we see who have climate pledges, are usually what we call companies with very high revenues and very high profit margins, but also very low emissions, especially if you consider emissions per million of revenues. So if you see here this chart, you may see like an ArcelorMittal, which is the exception, but the vast majority is financial sector, technology companies. So you have here Google, Microsoft, etc. Service companies as BCG, McKinsey, so all these companies usually with low carbon footprints, high revenues, high profits, so they kind of have the ability to commit to their climate pledges. But unfortunately, that is what it is. And usually consumer good companies as well. So most of the companies that used to have a large footprints, such as Shell, BP, Total, Equinor, RWE, etc., most of them already pulled out their climate pledges because of their challenges to stick to beyond carbon neutral, net zero, etc. Okay. So that's pretty much means that the demand got softer in comparison to 2020 Okay. Then supply, as I already said, supply is also kind of booming because then suddenly everyone can create their own standards. You have this sprouting of standards from 3 to 30, and then and as you can imagine, from the 30 standards that we have nowadays, or even more, not all of them generate what is considered a very high carbon credit. So it started all these discussions, okay, on the supply, we need to then find a way to define what is a high quality, because the last thing that we want is to have a bunch of crap credits that will create an excess of supply, will push prices down, and actually, if the credits are not good, then it means that we will not be promoting climate action. So ICVCM came as a solution for that. And as I said, from the previous Q&A, they focus on, well, you have the 3 layers: standard, methodology, and project, but they focus on standard methodology, and usually the rating agencies could focus on the project level, analyzing the project as equivalent to, okay, what is the risk? The risk related to the country where the project is developed, the risk related to the design and implementation of that, and the risk related to who is actually working on that. So usually when you are dealing with mature markets, with forward sales and futures and long-term acquisitions, yeah, this risk assessment is important. But when you do have a market that is dominated by spot transactions, yeah, the credit is generated, right? So there is not so much to relate to this risk. There is still, because you do have bad projects that were developed by bad project developers, for example, that can generate some reputational risks for you, but you don't have any concerns on the amount of the credits generated or the timing if the credits are already generated. But so what happened was this excess of supply, too many standards, too many, and one of the ways to control supply was the ICVCM and trying to separate high quality to low quality, trying to balance the prices. Okay. The problem is you didn't have anything that would anchor, or you still don't have a consensus on the quality of the standard. So what happens is that so you did have this increase on the demand, as you can see on these on the chart on the left, but you had a wide range of prices, and actually those prices they ended up varying by technology, by country, by vintage, etc. So people were dreaming of the carbon markets being a commodity again, as it was on the Kyoto phase. But during this voluntary phase, it couldn't be any further from a commodity because, yeah, you started to have to differentiate prices from forestry to renewable energy, from new vintages to old vintages, from one standard to another, etc. So it became a mess, right? And when you see companies who try to create exchanges, they started to create too many curves to each curve for each of these project types, etc. So that is just an illustration of that. And as you can see, what happened here to the voluntary carbon markets, you also had a boom and you also had a burst. So the prices went down, and yeah, I think 2023 and 2020 and first half of 24 especially was probably the lowest moment of the voluntary carbon markets. So my question to you, moving to Q&A, and my question to you is, in your opinion, what has been the main reason for the recent drop of interest on the voluntary carbon markets? Why there was this boom on the late 10s and early 20s, and why on 23, 24 that there was this massive decrease on price? And what we can do is something similar to the other cases. So, Rachel, what is the Q&A? And we cover that while we get some answers here.
Okay, so a couple of questions. Can you share a little bit of information on the types of buyers and what projects they're interested in? Are there certain, sectors and buyer types that are aligned to certain sectors? And then another interesting question, given the geopolitics, is has anybody, so what's your view in terms of the likely effects of the recent announcements by the United States on SDGs?
So this time I will start with first question first. So who is buying? I already presented on that slide. So you should expect as most of the buying volumes, at least the retirement and the usage of the volumes being related to service companies, being related to technology companies, being related to well, a mix of large and large corporations and SMEs, and a concentration of companies located here on the most developed countries. So US, European countries, a bit on Australia as well. You did have some development on other developing economies, such as Brazil, Indonesia, India, but that the volumes that are retired for final buyers for these companies, for these countries are still small. Okay. And actually, one of the problems of the voluntary carbon markets was the fact that it did happen a bit of the fast fashion element. So there was one year that everyone wanted renewable energy projects. Then renewable energy projects was out of fashion because someone criticized renewable energy projects, and then RED Plus was in fashion. And then everyone wanted RED Plus until you had some scandals on RED Plus, and no one wanted RED Plus anymore. Then it was cook stoves, and then cook stoves also got some criticism, and no one wanted cook stoves anymore. And then it's now the CDRs and so on. So again, it has changed. And if you ask me what is the preference today, actually, I don't know. No, there is a preference for usually charismatic projects, whatever charismatic means. But all the voluntary buyers usually want something that they can use for all their communications. They can show that their engagement go beyond climate impacts. You have all the SDGs and you have all the impacts beyond climate. But said that, you do have a couple of purchases related to the DAX and CCS and biochar that are very expensive, and companies who actually want to say that they help to promote these new technologies. Okay, so it does. You may see some trends, but yeah, each company will have its own taste and preference, and it will vary. It's not homogeneous. As I said, there is no common definition of high quality and preferences. So what you end up is that it's far from a commoditized market. It's definitely a market that you have to tailor to the taste of the client. Okay. Interesting. So people, so seeing here, jumping here to the quiz, people are blaming the drop on price on a kind of a supply shock. So fraudulent, low quality projects are coming to the market and generating probably an excess of supply and a challenge on people distinguishing what is good and bad, and probably linking to the complexity of climate claims and negative presses. Because yeah, the last thing that you want is to spend money to get a negative press. So buy carbon offsets that are low quality, and when you believe you're doing something good, you're actually being criticized by the fact that you bought low quality fraudulent projects. I do have a slightly different view. I do have a view that, well, the complexity of claims and the negative press definitely played a role. As I said, no one wants to spend money to be criticized. But I do see a very strong correlation of two things: the high inflation, high interest rates. So at some point when there was a lot of money in the market, and especially large corporations were going very well on their results, they could give them the luxury of buying more and more credits and have more bold climate claims. As soon as inflation and interest rates started to hurt the bottom line, we saw a lot of corporations retracting from their claims and pledges, even if they could blame the complexity of the negative press. But I think that the root cause was high inflation and interest rates. And also you could see some correlation with the international conflicts. So the Ukraine-Russia war and Middle East conflicts and the shifts of presidency across the world, creating greater uncertainty and people changing their mind on how to allocate their capital. So interesting to see that most of people believe that it was because of these low quality projects. I agree that that had a reason, but I do believe that the importance of international conflicts and high inflation, high interest is more important than what we have here. Moving to the last phase, because as you could see, Kyoto had the golden era, went down and kind of got replaced by the VCM. The VCM already had a short but a golden era, went down. Then the question is, what will happen next? Will it stand up again and grow again? Or are we talking about a potential replacement by the Paris Agreement phase? Okay. And I know that the details of the Paris Agreement and how to develop a project under the Paris Agreement will be dealt by the next class. But I just want to introduce here some few concepts of the Paris Agreement that were kind of revolutionary and make the Paris Agreement as a very distinctive phase in comparison to the others. So look, Kyoto was a top-down thing, right? So the world agreed what was the goal and then imposed that goal from the top to the bottom. That actually really created a challenge of a negotiation of the extension of the Kyoto. So what happened was that Paris became a bottom-up. So they said, okay, for us to unlock these negotiations, we will not impose anything. Each of you come and say how you can contribute. And that is the national determined contribution that each country did on what is their emission reduction pathway. Okay. The other big difference of the Paris Agreement is that, remember that I mentioned Kyoto Protocol was marginal abatement. Here is a pathway to net zero, aiming 2030, 40, or 50, right? And the key mechanisms that Paris Agreement created was, okay, every 5 years you do need to provide a revised NDC, or National Determined Contribution. You try to always improve the transparency of your carbon inventory and your NDC. Every 5 years you have this global stock take. We review all the NDCs and we try to come with new NDCs, always a bit more ambitious than the previous one. We try to promote support to developing countries, and we do use market mechanisms for such support. Okay, and then the market mechanisms created by the Paris Agreement, it's what we call the Article 6, which, even if we call it market mechanisms, it came with the non-market approaches. It came with the Article 6.4, or the Mechanism for Sustainable Development, which is pretty much a replacement of the CDM, or the cooperative approaches, or Article 6.2, which is pretty much bilateral agreements between one buying country and one sell country. So the big difference between 6.2 and 6.4 is that 6.2, as I said, is one buying country, one sell country, is always one-to-one. 6.4, similar to CDM, one country generates a credit, doesn't need to have a buyer. That credit could be used by literally anyone. So Paris Agreement. So today, as is the reference that I already used before, We are literally just after 2021 when we had the Marrakesh Accords and all the regulations were done. So now I do expect a ramp up of the Paris Agreement prospects, right? I think that the boom of the voluntary carbon markets and climate finance did generate some delays on the Paris Agreement regulation, but I think now we have everything that we need to start running. Look, I already provided some explanation of the 6.2 and 6.4. As I said, is a bilateral, decentralized, while the 6.4 is UN managed and centralized. But I will this little chart here is very similar to the previous one, that one country reduces and accounts for such reductions. I think the key point here is that now we have a global inventory. So any emission reduction that is transferred from one country to another, we do have to apply this concept of corresponding adjustment. So on your national inventory, you have to apply. If you export, you have to apply your corresponding adjustment. Okay, so the example here is a country emits 100, and it says that we will reduce to 80. Actually, it managed to reduce to 60, but 20 it sells as offsets for or on international markets. So it adjusts its carbon inventory and ends up reporting 80, which is aligned with the NDC goal. Okay. And as I said, the Article 6.2, because it requires less infrastructure, you do have it jump started in relation to the 6.4. So here is just to say, look, the supply and demand of Article 6, both of them are still under construction, but you already have an indication that a couple of European countries and Asian countries are the main drivers of demand nowadays. And then you have a wider range of supply, with African countries being responsible for the highest number of countries, not necessarily of credits. And on the demand side, we do have an estimation of demand of roughly 100 to 200 million tons of ETMOs up to 2030, which will give us something on the range of 20 to 30 million tons up to 2030. But the expectation is that by 2040 or 50, that number can go up very much. Okay. We don't have one single source of carbon pricing for Paris Agreement, so I will not go through that. But you do have a wide range of prices seen on the market today, literally ranging from 10 to 20 to 50 or $60. Okay. The likelihood that those carbon prices will adhere to local carbon prices, it's high, but we don't know yet who will be the price maker and who will be a price taker in terms of this demand generation. Then here I do have also two quick questions. So which market segment will lead the supply of the Paris Agreement? And the second question is, who will be the price maker of the Paris Agreement? So CORSIA, Asian countries, European countries. Okay. Look, due to time constraints, I will move on. But we can already see the trend. People believe that the majority of the supply should come from new projects in Africa and new projects in Asia. I'm aligned. And CORSIA would be the driver of demand. It's an interesting view. Let me move on because time management. Lessons and comparisons. It's basically trying to compare what happened to the different phases, right? So again, on Kyoto Protocol, you had this demand formation based on two geographies, so Europe and Japan. VCM was a very dispersed demand formation. At some point, you had excess of forces forming the demand, and the demand got confused, right? Paris Agreement today, the demand is being formed by, as I said, few European countries, Asian countries, and Corsia. The demand size was 150 million tons per year, roughly, during the Kyoto period. We saw during the peak VCM achieving the equivalent to that. It's retracting a bit, but we never managed to achieve similar prices to the Kyoto Protocol. And on the short term, we believe that the Paris Agreement will still be smaller than the two phases, but yeah, eventually with potential to increase. We already know collapse on the Kyoto Protocol with the exit of Japan and Europe. VCM, as discussed later, different views. People believe that was a supply shock. I do believe that was more of a demand shock. But for the Paris Agreement is what can we do to avoid having a demand collapse, right? And talking about these three phases, so again, I'm coming here from 2005 to 12 as the first phase, 12 to 20 and after 20, and analyzing the evolution of projects by technology distribution. So as you can see here, up to 2012, the bulk of the projects were renewable energy projects. The bulk of the emission reductions were from industrial projects, basically N2O and HFC projects. After 2012, you could see the big decrease on industrial issuances, basically because it was not accepted anymore by European trading schemes. But the renewable energy kept a certain degree of growth up to 2018, when you started to see a growth of RED Plus and cook stove projects. And then you see like the most recent years with a domination of actually forestry and cook stove projects. Even if you can see some inertia and continuation of issuance from renewable energy projects, even if a big decrease on the number of renewable energy projects. Okay. So again, pre-Kyoto, the top three technologies, renewable, landfill, and HFC in terms of number of projects, but HFC and N2O, renewables and landfill in terms of credits issued. And you can see the shift on the top three technologies during the three phases. And what is interesting to see as a shift is basically a shift from infrastructure projects to what I'm calling here community and land-based projects. So a lot of agriculture, a lot of forestry, being reforestation or RED Plus, a lot of cook stoves, both in terms of number of projects and issuance of credits. Okay. Will the Paris Agreement reinforce this trend? Are we going to continue with basically land and community-based projects during the Paris Agreement phase? To be seen. On geography, it's interesting that the early days, the CDM was what we would call the BRIC area, so the Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Those statistics here do not have JI, so Russia is not here, but you could assume that Russia, especially on number of credits, would be on the top three, right? And with the time, you saw China going away and being replaced by other countries. What I found quite interesting is to see that after 2022, Kenya and Nepal, they come on the list of top 5 countries with most number of registered projects. Okay. And one criticism related to geography that has always happened is that, yeah, usually 80% of the projects, they will be located on a small number of countries. Here you can see that they are located either on developed economies or more developed transition economies, such as Brazil, China, India, Thailand, or Indonesia. Okay. And those two charts are the proportion of credits issued by each country and the proportion of and then the volumes of credits. You could see that US, because of their local markets and because of their detachment of the UN platform, on the early days they were quite dominant. But as UN got a grip, then US was dwarfed by the UN and voluntary mechanisms. You can see the moment that China and India dominated the market, China went down, and you had a greater distribution of countries. Okay, but one challenge that we still have today is the participation of least developed countries. So I really hope that the Paris Agreement can be one of the mechanisms that can help the development of a greater amount of projects and activities and development activities on least developed countries. Okay. Standard evolution, as I said, from 3 to 30. On this 30, an interesting pattern was the creation of a lot of specialized standards, because originally all the standards would cover all and everything, but nowadays you do see standards that only cover CDR projects or ARR projects or RED Plus projects, etc. We also saw the process of UN standard to not-for-profit standards to actually for-profit standards, which is a pattern that we see today. So again, UN was the first one. When you talk about the biggest standards, VCS, Gold Standard, GCC, all of them are non-profit organization. But we see today an inflow of for-profit standards. So companies that want to make the carbon issuance a business. So it may have some governance issues, but yeah. And the question is, with the Paris Agreement, are we coming back now to the UN dominant standard? If I had more time, I would discuss that, but given time management, I'm posing here the questions for reflection. But yeah, do we need so many standards? What are the consequences of that? Does it create indeed a driver for innovation because we have these specialized standards, or does it create confusion because then buyers need to be highly educated to know what is a good or bad standard, if a new standard can be good since the beginning, or they need traction, lessons learned, etc. So that is definitely a topic that we have on the discussion today. There's no right or wrong answer, but time will say what will be the balance. And look, a lot of criticism is done today, and I do like to put some stuff into perspective, right? So as it was said before, I joined the market in 2003, and I was based in Brazil, so a developing country, and there was very, very limited internet access. So at that point of time, for you to do a PDD, for example, you would literally need to go to library and seek for books and reports. And usually at our office, we would have a collection of printed reports, so we could use that as reference and so on. There was no internet. The collaboration across different offices, or the concept of an international company, was very, very, very hard to implement. So, but I saw how internet managed to change the game, to speed up the flow of information, to accelerate the cycle of development, of you checking, improving, publishing a new version of methodologies, and allowing a greater level of transparency. As I could see during these last 5 years or so, how big data and GIS is actually also changing the game, right? So it's quite often, sometimes I try to remember people when they criticize RED Plus methodology. They forget that RED Plus methodology, the first one, was actually developed in 2007. So in a moment that even internet on most of the locations was not there, big data, well, the processing capacity was far from what we have today. And then people say, yeah, today we can do things very differently from before. So again, all that is definitely changing the way that we do We develop carbon projects, how we monitor that. So, for example, the deployment of Internet of Things, the discussions on how can we now digitalize the monitoring process and accelerate issuance. How close are we to that? Token blockchain, like it was a buzz on the market. Are we over it, or is it still part of the future on the carbon markets? And more recently, I started to see AI everywhere. Is it indeed a solution that will bring the transaction costs down, or actually all these technologies do not solve a lot of the problems that we have on carbon projects, which is the human interaction, the fact that we need real action on the ground and not only solutions on a virtual wall. That is to be seen. But I do wonder what will be the next technologies that people will try to bring in order to try to accelerate the development of carbon projects and to facilitate that process and to increase the quality of what is done. Okay. On this time, no time for quizzes. Last but not least, right? So I do talk about a phase 4 of carbon markets, and for me, what this phase 4 means. And the first remark is, I don't know if this phase 4 is a potential reality or is just my wish list of what I would like to see happen. But anyway, I will share my view of what should be a phase 4, right? So a phase 4 would mean that a greater decrease of neo-carbon markets, neo-carbon pricing policies being developed across the world. And where it doesn't exist, we develop that. Maybe because it doesn't exist on a country, so we develop that on that country, or because on a country that it already exists, it covers only a few scopes, and we increase the scope of that. This little chart here just shows that, for example, the power sector is included in pretty much all the markets. But when you go to domestic aviation, landfill, building, like you have just a couple of cases that includes that as a scope of emissions. And so, as I said before, only 24% of the emissions are covered by carbon pricing, and we can increase that to above 60 or 60. And we do have here examples of ETSs that covers 48 or even 89% of the emissions. Okay. Those markets today, we have a bunch of disconnected markets. And on my dream, the phase 4 of the carbon markets would be all these getting connected, and we have an international market again. Okay. And if we do have an international market again, we may have a single carbon pricing again, and that would definitely help us to accelerate, provide a carbon signal to the market and accelerate capital deployment for climate action and emission reduction. And somehow VCM, the voluntary and compliance markets aligning, right? So the two of them understanding that they will be competing for the same pot of supply, and then the prices will be the same. Either you are covered by a compliance scheme or not. But yeah, seeing what's going on the world, I do wonder if with all these conflicts and kind of a deglobalization agenda that's going on, if that will be possible or not. But I do want to be a Don Quixote and believe that, yeah, impossible dreams are actually possible realities, and that we will need to work harder. And it's great to have such a high audience, because then we have more people that can multiply this message of us having to work together towards these connected and unique carbon markets. We are over time, not too much, but if we do have time, if Goldstone allow us, we can have a last Q&A session before closure.
Actually, we're in very good time, Pablo, because we have about scheduled like 45 minutes left, but we have also lots of questions. So maybe Rachel can.
So then we do that.
Yeah.
I thought we were short on time.
Yeah, zoom through the last bit. Yeah.
So good to know that then we have 45 minutes, and then we can have a broader discussion. I can even see if I can come back, how I can do to see the results of all the quizzes. So I will stop sharing and try to see the results of the quizzes. But meanwhile, Rachel, what are the
Okay. So yeah,
questions?
just jumping around to slightly earlier sections, there's a question about what's your perspective on applying a corresponding adjustment to a VCM project? And there's two schools of thought on this issue, that corresponding adjustments are indications of integrity, or others that believe that the VCM actors are not parties, so it should be a different system.
That is a very good question. Look, today, the way that the world is organized, you do have two accounting systems that are somehow connected, but not fully connected, right? So you have the national inventories and you have the corporate inventories. And the analogy that I like to do is with economy. So you do have the national GDP and you do have the corporate financial statements. They may be correlated, but they are not the same thing. So my view is that applying corresponding adjustments for voluntary pledges, you are just punishing one side of the equation, which is the supplier country, and you are not creating any benefit for the other side of the equation. So if you want to promote climate action, you can promote climate action without punishing the supply side of the equation, especially if you assume that the supplier tends to be on the range of the poorer countries of the world, and they need all the support is welcome without necessarily them having to provide the corresponding adjustment. So, in my view, as the two accounting systems are done today, for me, it's not necessary that you do need to apply corresponding adjustment for voluntary pledges. Again, the company would not be benefiting of that, but you would be punishing, or you would be creating further difficulties and challenges to the supplying country. So I tend to say that let's leave the corresponding adjustments for the compliance side of the equation, and leave the voluntary with this lower level of requirements on the supply side. But said that, I would be of support of even voluntary projects somehow seeking some sort of national approval and engagement with the national with the host country government. I think that the voluntary markets, as it is today, that people do things with no connection with the government and with no alignment with the government plans, etc., is kind of an issue. But you're right. There are different lines of thoughts. And by the way, one of the lines of thoughts is that if you don't get the corresponding adjustment, then you just adjust your claim, right? Which I'm fine with that.
Great, thanks, Pablo. There's another question on Article 6.4 asking, can you use the gold standard as a protocol?
Not for the 6.4, but you can use for 6.2. So, and that is a big difference. Like 6.4, by definition, is the use of the UN standard and the UN mechanism. So you cannot use another standard or platform for 6.4. But for 6.2, two countries can agree on any platform that they want. So, for example, the Swiss government tends to use gold standard for their 6.2 transactions, and because the 6.2, the UN oversees the transaction, not the project. The project that will provide information or the results, the transaction. As I said, Switzerland uses gold standard. Singapore has a couple of partnerships in place with VCS, GCC, gold standard. Japan, they use for 6.2 the Japanese carbon mechanism, or JCM. So each country has the freedom to choose whatever they want. And today, usually that definition is done by the buyer side more than the supplier side. But yeah, it would be interesting to see if the situation changes and then the host countries or the selling countries start to also be able to impose which standard they want to use to the market. Okay.
Brilliant.
Sorry, just one more thing. No, just one more thing on that. CORSIA. So CORSIA actually came with a list of standards that is acceptable on CORSIA. Okay. 6.4 is one of them, but they do accept also which would be equivalent to 6.2 transactions. So a host country using VCS or gold standard, having a corresponding adjustment and using those credits to CORSIA.
That's a good point. So there's a question here from somebody from Botswana, in terms of, looking at markets. There's no carbon markets. And this person's from the university and focusing a lot on agriculture and natural resources. So with a country like Botswana that hasn't anything in place, where should they start in terms of building that capacity and operationalizing carbon markets?
Look, usually we could see the pattern that carbon markets tend to happen on where you have a certain level of critical mass on the economy, at least in terms of defining an ETS or carbon tax. So that is a trend. Of course, it's not a rule. But usually it starts with you mapping where are your emissions and where you do have a good kind of concentration. So, for example, it's very difficult to apply a carbon ETS or carbon tax to the agricultural sector because the agricultural sector has a lot of sources of emissions. So it's the N2O from fertilizers, is the change of use of land, will be the growth or the emissions related to the biomass growth or the forestry growth. So it becomes a quite complex sector. And on average, you do have the sector being dominated by small farmers. So it's quite hard for you to then educate and enforce these kind of things on some small farmers. So usually what you end up having is these kind of things being related to, as I said, industry and power sectors, right? So countries with a lot of industry, especially large-scale industry, tends to be the countries that put that together first. And I know you do have some tricks that sometimes you can play on the different levels of the supply chain. So, for example, transportation, usually would be quite difficult for you to implement a carbon pricing if you play at the level of consumption of the transportation fuel. But usually you have some concentration and consolidation when you're dealing with distribution of the fuel. So usually the carbon pricing, carbon taxes applied to the transportation sector is done at this higher level of the supply chain. Okay. But the study that you would need to do is, okay, where are your emissions, which sectors, how the sector is organized on your country? Do you have a point of measurement and control? And with a number of players that is not low enough to make a dysfunctional market, but is not high enough that becomes too complex and expensive for you to implement a carbon pricing scheme, which is quite different from developing a carbon project. Okay, carbon project, as I showed, you do see that trend of going to smaller scale interventions, so the cook stoves, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, and then a lot of people trying to use these tools related to GIS, IoT, software platforms to enable this aggregation of small-scale initiatives.
Great, thanks, Pablo. There's a few questions coming in around sort of governance, integrity, oversight. So, do you think there's a need for a global regulatory body for oversight of the carbon market in terms of the credits being sold? And also slightly linked to this is, what is your view on government's involvement in setting their own standards for carbon projects?
So the first one is talking about transactions. The second one then is about the supply, right? So on the transaction side, as I said, for 6.2, UN will be recording the transactions. But again, when we talk about the 6.2, it's country to country, and it's usually the supplier to the final user. So you don't have what we would be calling the secondary market, right? So you have only the primary market with just this single transaction. You may see a secondary market on the CORSIA, but and people are trying to work on that. So yeah, and you do have initiatives being developed and led by the World Bank and IETA on trying to oversee all these transactions. So that is called the CAD Trust. I can later on send more information about that. But yeah, this CAD Trust is literally one of the analogies is the central bank of the carbon market, which is trying to oversee all the carbon transactions inside countries, international transactions, and even exchanges and platforms. So you do have this process being done, but usually that is just to monitor the flow of carbon, not to have any say on the price of the carbon. Okay. So again, UN will monitor the 6.2. You do have this hybrid private public initiative for the monitoring of the market as a whole. So people are working on that. And the second question was related to national standards, right?
Standards, yeah.
So look, I do see, and I do understand that the governments are setting up national standards if they want to supply and serve national markets. I think it's trickier to have governments setting up standards to serve international markets. So, for example, I've heard already from negotiators that they were not willing to use international voluntary standards for the international transactions because the government didn't have any governance or influence on the voluntary standard. So that country would prefer to always stick to the UN mechanisms because the UN mechanisms are created and managed by countries, and the country and the government would have a say on the governance of that. So, but what is happening, especially with the delays on the UN side, is that countries that are creating local markets. So nowadays, most of the ETSs and the carbon taxes, they tend to rely on flexibility mechanisms, but locally sourced. So a great example is the South Africa. So South Africa created a carbon tax scheme. They do accept offsets as a flexibility mechanism, but they only accept offsets that are generated within South Africa. To jumpstart the process, they started using a bunch of voluntary standards and the UN standards as eligible standards for the carbon tax. But little by little, they are talking about creating their own standard to adequate to their own reality and be used for their national carbon tax purposes. I don't see any problems on that. I just see that it will be unlikely that, let's say, Japan will be willing to buy credits from the South Africa carbon standards. So that is my kind of expectation. But we did see some local standards trying to become international. That was the case of Colombia. So when Colombia created a carbon tax and accepting also only Colombian projects, there was a sprout of some Colombian standards that were not government-led on this case. They were voluntary standards. So they were originally created to attend the local demand of the Colombian market, but at some point, some of these standards started to be international standards. Like the Ser Carbono is a great example. So nowadays, Ser Carbono has projects with a focus on Latin America, but yeah, it is an international standard. But it's voluntary or private, not governmental. But I don't see any problems on governments trying to create standards that are focused and specialized the government to the national reality. I just don't expect that to be acceptable at international level.
Right. There's another couple of questions on technology and the role that technology can play. So the first is looking at blockchain and smart contracts and how they can impact the transparency and efficiency for clean energy projects in the next 5 to 10 years. And slightly linked to that, who are the players needed in terms of smart cook stove projects with an IoT application for real-time fuel consumption and carbon accounting?
Sorry, the last question is, who are the players?
Yeah.
Or what are...
Who are the players that are needed in terms of a smart cook stove project with an IoT application for real time? Yeah, I guess who are there technology providers out there that are providing that in your experience, Pablo?
Yeah, so starting with the first one, IoT, smart contracts, etc. You do have bold and big visions on what technology can unlock, but we do see that it can be something very easy to be implemented to some specific sectors, but it's quite challenging to be widely applicable. So I do see IoT being deployed on some few technologies, probably on the upcoming months or years, but on others taking much longer. Example, renewable energy. You do have already digital meters for everything related to renewable energy. So with transmission of data, protocols, everything super well established, and so it's not difficult to start to accelerate the process of collection, transmission of data for renewable energy projects. The only thing that we need to remember is that when we do a verification, and I don't know if you remember the slides, but we do check the monitored parameters for calculating the emission reduction process, but we do check a bunch of other things. So the impact assessment, the stakeholders, if the license is in place, if the project didn't change the install capacity and the design, etc. And for all these other aspects, I think it's quite challenging to make everything automated and you manage to finalize the verification in 2 clicks. What I already actually discussed, even with Gold Standard in the past, was separating this data collection for emission reduction. And you do have processes and procedures just for that, and assessing all these other aspects that are related to the eligibility of a project. So as I said, stakeholder engagement, design of the project, licenses to operate, and etc. And eventually we may end up with a process that you generate credits based on IoT and based on these automatic protocols for data transfer every month or every week. But yeah, once a year, you still need to do the traditional validation verification process to check all the other aspects of the project. Okay, so I believe that can be done, but that is not a silver bullet that will make all and everything simple, because carbon projects, they have many other aspects beyond the climate impact. So and that is quite difficult to fully digitalize. And on IoT and cook stoves, as we move now to electric cooking, we do see a greater capability of scaling IoT, and also we do see a decrease on costs of IoT. But I remember a couple of years ago when we were talking about biomass cook stoves, that implementing sensors and stuff would be more expensive than the stove itself. So the idea was then, no, let's not do that. But we see now that being implemented. And usually who is implementing that is the manufacturer of the equipment. So the manufacturer of the cook stoves are the ones who are now, since the design, trying to incorporate all these sensors, IoTs, and data transfer processes, etc., for being able to collect the information about the stove usage, the stove location, and etc. So we do see this pattern as all the appliances at home become smart and as the IoT costs go down. And there was a question on blockchain. Yeah, look, at some point, blockchain was the word, and then it went away. So that's why at some point I raised the question: is blockchain still part of the future of carbon market, or is something from the past? I don't expect tokenization of carbon credits. I think that is something from the past. But yeah, blockchain as a way to provide traceability of data and facilitate the validation and verification of the data, I do see future for that.
Okay, makes sense. So there's another question here about Article 6.4. And the question is, should the UNFCCC standards be higher and stricter than existing ones? So almost creating like a race to the top. And then what impact might that have in terms of the existing voluntary standards?
It's a good question. So look, the race to the top, like if you start to be too stringent, you start to block things that you shouldn't block, right? So as I said, these elements of false negatives and false positives is always something that you're going to be trying to walk on a thin line. I think that the advantage of voluntary standards are the fact that eventually they can embrace quicker technologies. So because you do see, like, the 6.4 has the mandate literally to be applicable to everything and everywhere, which is always a challenge. While voluntary standards may have this approach of, yeah, I will not be applicable everywhere. I will be focused on a couple of countries. So by being focused on a couple of countries, you can already lock in a bunch of assumptions that you know that are applicable for that country, even if it would be not applicable to all the countries in the world. If you focus on a couple of technologies, or project types, you can embrace technology on that. So these specialized standards can be one of the ways to accelerate innovation. And I would expect that UN would always has this tendency of being a late adopter of these innovations. So I think that the two of them actually can work well together and complement each other. But I don't see that race to the top because, again, if you start to be too strict, you start to have too many false negatives. So things that cannot comply with the standard, but that shouldn't be the case.
Right. Another question that's sort of coming around the role of Indigenous peoples, which we, surprisingly haven't mentioned yet, an important stakeholder group. Can you say a few words about Indigenous peoples, their role in carbon market projects, and what are some of the best practices, lessons learned from your experience in the market?
Sure. So generally, and I'm saying generally because for sure there will be exceptions to that, but generally the indigenous people, they are involved on land use projects, right? So that is the most typical situation. So, and what science shows is that indigenous people, they are very effective stakeholders when we want to deal with sustainable use of the land. So either by conserving forest or by deploying sustainable practices for agriculture. But quite often, those indigenous people may have challenges on proving their land title, ownership, etc. You do have nowadays a lot of guidance and a lot of materials, usually not necessarily in the standard, because the guidances tend to be quite generic and difficult to make something that are globally applicable. But you have a lot of guidances on how to consider how to consider the project development with indigenous lands. So the element of free informed prior consent on developing a project, the involvement of the respecting the local organization and the local culture as part of the project design, and then having a fair distribution of the revenues and proceeds of any carbon project. So you do have guidance on that. So CI, TNC, WWF, all of them already provide developed a couple of guidance on that. So for example, on the distribution, they usually indicate that the minimum amount should be 50% of the proceeds going to indigenous communities and local communities, but ideally 70% or more. You do have a lot of guidance on how to do all these FPIC process. Sometimes countries that have the indigenous communities as an important aspect will also have the local regulation processes. So, for example, we are working on indigenous land projects in Brazil and Philippines, and those two countries have a lot of regulations on how to deal and engage with them. So you always have to also respect that. But yeah, these aspects of you respecting their culture, their organization, being fair to them are usually aspects that are fundamental on the design of a program. And usually, whenever possible, yeah, you co-design, right? So you can bring your international expertise and experiences, etc. But yeah, you have to co-design with them rather than impose on them what they have to do. And as I said, the most typical type of project associated with indigenous communities is the REDD+ or the forestry conservation, because science already showed that you do have a lot of studies that shows that that is a very efficient way of conserving forest.
Great answer. We have one more question on, do you think we need separate systems for carbon removals versus carbon mitigation projects? Specifically, talking about an example would be the MRV measurement, where precision becomes a barrier for scaling, especially with removal projects. What approaches would you like to see?
One of the biggest challenges on removals is not precision, it's permanence. We do have three types of carbon removals. So we have what we call biological, geological, and industrial, right? So industrial is the one that is very easy to monitor. Usually you do have a very controlled process, and as I said, easy to monitor. The geological, you have the CCS, which has an industrial aspect of it, so it's very easy to monitor. You have, for example, enhanced rock weathering, where you spread specific types of rocks on the land, and it accelerates the absorption of carbon by such rocks. That is a bit trickier to monitor. And you have the biological ones, which also we already have a pretty sophisticated technologies to monitor that. But the issue that all of these face are permanences, and how you can guarantee the permanence, if the permanence time frame should be 10, 20, 100, or 1,000 years, and so on. So the challenge today is usually related to more these aspects of permanence, and in some cases a bit of the MRV. But so the question is more how we deal with the permanency. If we already have some few things that has been tested. So, for example, the CDM created the concept of temporary offset to deal with the permanence. Was not a big success, but the voluntary standards, they applied other other technologies, they came more with the buffer approach, right? So, okay, look, we, again, using the analogy of the financial sector, of the financial reserves of a central bank to rescue any bank in problems, right? So it's the same here. So every project, for every 100 tons that is issued, you get like 20, and you put on this central reserve. And then if one project fails, you use that reserve to compensate for that. What usually it's quite difficult is, what about if you have a systemic failure on all the projects of that type? Then the buffer doesn't work. But today, that is the kind of best approach we have so far to deal with the permanence issue of projects. And the discussion about removal and reduction, that is a lengthy one, because of this net zero concept, that you can only achieve net zero if you remove what you emit, which I agree. But right now, and on the next 10 to 15 years, I would say the focus of the majority of the companies and majority of the countries are on accelerate the reduction. So I wouldn't come with these, in my view, it's not the right time right now to provide greater preference on removals rather than reduction. What we need to do now is to really accelerate our levels of reductions. And then when we reach the, as a society and not as a country, when we reach very low levels of emission and we consider those unavoidable and unabatable, then it's time to really focus and prioritize completely the removals. But until there, yeah, our emissions, they haven't peaked yet. So I think the focus has to be on reductions, or at least on an efficient capital allocation. If the reductions are cheaper than removals, you focus on reductions. If removals are cheaper than reductions, you focus on removals. But yeah, the key word now is speed. So go for the cheapest option and accelerate the decarbonization, or accelerate the process of reducing the concentration of CO2 on the atmosphere.
But I mean, your point's really interesting about the measurement of net zero, and segues nicely into a couple of questions on about SBTI and their requirements. So one of them is programs like SBTI, very strict requirements on how and what carbon credits a company use can meet their net zero goals. Where do you well, there's one about what's your view on the latest guidance, and then where do you see substantial demand for carbon credits by corporates coming from in the future?
So look, SBTI, they always had the position that you should prioritize on reducing and only reducing, and reducing internally. So that's why they came with the position of not accepting offsets. Then they started to flexibilize to, okay, accept offsets for scope 3 emissions that are not fully in control by you, but you use offsets somehow, you can have some sort of carbon contribution. But not a lot of people support that view and believe that SBTI should adopt perhaps an approach closer to the other carbon pricing schemes. So offsets should be a flexibility mechanism, not a driver. So flexibility means, yeah, a small percentage of your emissions eventually can be achieved with that. And with that, you're going to be accelerating the decarbonization in other areas, being other sectors or the geographies in relation to where you are based. But yeah, there are a lot of changes going on SBTI, and I wouldn't be surprised if they change a bit their position, but I'm not in place to say if they will change or when they will change. But I agree, SBTI has a quite strict view of the world, and their strict view is that you should prioritize and only prioritize your own reduction, but that is not what cap and trade system advocates. It advocates for companies talking to each other and trying to find a more efficient allocation of capital, and with that reducing the social cost of reducing the carbon emissions.
Okay, and anything on sort of future demand, where you see that might come from in the future for voluntary carbon credits?
It's a good question. So you do have SBTi dealing with that. You do have VCMI. So again, on VCMI, at some point you had IC, VCM, and VCMI. And for them to not overlap too much, you had kind of a division, even if it's not an official division, of IC-VCM focusing on supply, VCMI focusing on demand, and VCMI. But VCMI at the same time was trying to accommodate all the different views of CDPs and SBTIs and GHG protocols and whatever other players. So they have been struggling to find this common sense. But eventually, with the changes on SBTI, VCMI can now have such a bring everyone together and try to unify all the demands, make the climate claims simpler and more straightforward. And I think that could eventually unlock some demand. But the other aspect that was a key element of demand that people do not talk so much about it was the fact that ESG became an important driver for investors. Then companies started to focus a lot on the ESG to be able to access more capital, and then started to use offsets as a way for doing that. With the ESG now weakening, it is a question then what would be a replacement of demand driver to the ESG agenda.
Brilliant. One other final question at the moment is back to Article 6. So it's like, how can the risk of revocation in Article 6.2 be minimised to provide a greater certainty for buyers and investors? And do you think that corresponding adjustments, stricter letters of approval, issuance controls, or emerging insurance products covering revocation might be a good solution?
I would divide this the answer of this question in two. So, look, a country having a very good understanding of what is its NDC and having a very good plan to reach the NDC will give a greater confidence of what they should or they should not issue corresponding adjustments. So I think host countries doing this homework of understanding what is their NDC, what is their pathway to the NDC, how they're going to do that, and which sectors they want to rely on international or not support is the first step to minimize chances of disputes around revocations of corresponding adjustments or not, because the host country would have a greater confidence that they did the right thing, right? On countries that do not do this exercise, and because of political pressure here or there, lobbying, etc., they start issuing corresponding adjustments without any control or consciousness, the likelihood of disputes in the future because of a change of government, a change of mind, or whatever is higher. So what I advise to people today is that if you want to develop a 6.4 agreement, Article 6 contract, is similar to working with indigenous communities. Like, you should design things together with indigenous communities. So in this case, design things together with the countries and ensure that the country has a good level of ownership and consciousness on the decision that they are making. So that is a key aspect. But assuming that even with that, you are still not comfortable, you do have today a series of insurance solutions for that. You do have MIGA, which is the insurance company of the World Bank, and a lot of other smaller insurance shops that are coming with solutions for that. But be aware that you have a wide range of risks, and not all the insurances will cover all the risks that you may have. You may have the risk of revocation, but the risk of the corresponding adjustment, or risk of revocation of letter of approval, or anything like that, and then all different insurances will cover these different aspects of the risk. But there are solutions being designed today. As I said, MIGA is working on that, and other insurance companies are working on that. So it does bring a great confidence to the market. It's just the question that we are trying to finalize today is, what will the cost of that comfort? If we prefer to pay for that and have the comfort, or if it is too expensive, and we may need to live with some level of risk related to that.
Right, thanks, Pablo. We've pretty much reached the end of the questions. So, David, I don't know if I want to hand back to you, and then we can do a final wrap up.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thank you. Huge thank you to Pablo for fielding and guiding us through this session over the last couple of hours. And I've certainly found it very informative. I hope you have as well in our audience. To those of you who asked, we will make a recording available, and we'll upload it to our website, and we'll inform you about it. So look out for notifications there. Thank you very much for the great questions. We had loads of them. And as I said before, this is the first of 3 in our masterclass series. So there will be another 2. Pablo actually already alluded to the topics. So next week we'll be talking about Article 6 and Article 6.4 specifically. So there were already several questions which are related to that. So if you come next week, we'll be going through in detail what that actually looks like and the differences between 6.2 and 6.4. And also, if you are interested in developing an Article 6.4 or an Article 6 generally, a project under Article 6, what practically does that mean for what you need to do? And then we also had some questions about the financial elements. And so that will be the topic of our last masterclass, which will be looking at actually where does the money come from to finance these activities. As Pablo mentioned at the beginning, there is this issue between you obviously need upfront investment finance, but your revenue is only coming often sometimes it's quite delayed because you have to wait for the credits to be verified and then issued. So we'll be diving into those topics. So if you haven't already signed up, please do. The sign up links are on our website where you found the registration for this one as well. But otherwise, it just remains to say a huge thanks to Pablo for this presentation. And his email was presented on the screen. So if anyone, I guess, is interested to get in touch, they can do so with Pablo. But otherwise, yeah, thank you for joining us. Thanks for Pablo and Rachel, and hopefully we'll see many of you for our next 2 sessions.
Thank you, David. And as last words of my presentation, I do believe we're in the beginning of a new cycle. As I said, the phase 3 is this Paris Agreement, this Article 6 related. And I think it's the beginning of this new cycle. And my hope is that the next cycle, or what I'm calling phase 4, comes before we have any burst of this cycle. So I'm quite optimistic. I'm quite excited with the latest developments and across the world. So despite some questions sometimes, and I do have great optimism, and I do see a promising short-term and long-term future for the carbon markets, and for all who want to get involved on this sector and this type of activity. We need to work harder. The climate crisis just gets more bigger and bigger. So yeah, more people and working harder will be important elements of our near future.
Fantastic. It's a brilliant message to end on.
Thank you very much, David, and the Gold Standard team. And I look forward to engaging with all of you again. So feel free to contact me on the email that I showed on my screen, or reach out EcoSecurities communication channels, LinkedIn's, or websites, and etc. So
Great. With that, we'll call it a day here. Wish you a good rest of the day where you are, and hopefully we'll see you for our next workshop.
Thank you, everyone.